You would expect miniature painting to be really simple, just brushes and acrylic paints. How many times have you heard in a video that you are doing it wrong? And it just doesn't help that there's so much information out there that is labeled the best and the fastest and the greatest. All of that can be confusing and daunting as hell if you just got into this amazing hobby and you're trying to find your way. But what has helped me the most when I started painting was to learn all of these basic brush techniques, because that gave me a really good foundation and an understanding that I could build upon. And I wish I had someone that showed me all of this when I started, how you do these techniques, what they're good for, and when they might not work. So today let's discuss 7 brush techniques that every beginner painter should know. Number 1, base coating. When you're starting out, it will probably not have an airbrush yet, so we need another way to get a base layer of paint down very quickly and in a reliable way. And what I did here was to add a Senator white step over the black primer that I applied first, but we're not using that in this video since we will not work with transparent paints. It's just a miniature that I had sitting around and that was ready to go. So it doesn't matter what primer you're using, a white primer will usually make the colors a bit more intense and a black primer will dull them down a bit more. And while the primer helps making your colors stick to the mini, the base colors are going to be your foundation. They're the layer that you will be working off of, no matter what technique you're going to be using afterwards. So I want my base colors to be a solid layer, no dark or bright spots showing, but I also don't want this to take ages, so I'm grabbing a big brush that can hold a lot of paint. I like using these synthetic brushes with sturdier bristles that I don't care much about, because using a brush this way is usually a bit hard on them. So don't use your expensive brushes because they will wear out and they will be damaged very quickly. Then what I do is I'm picking my base color almost undiluted, just the brush having been tipped into water once, and I'm pushing the paint onto the mini. You can see that I almost rub the paint into the recesses. Just make sure that your paint goes everywhere and you're not leaving any primer to show. Usually, the first layer covers really nicely, especially over white, but I tend to give it one more layer to really smooth out the base color and build that consistent first layer. In the end, how many colors you will need depends on the brand you're using and what color you picked. Here I'm blocking the colors in that will define my color scheme. So the emerald and beige. And during this step, it usually makes sense to put down all of the base colors that you want on your miniature if you want to get an idea whether or not your color scheme works. Here I really only have one more color to add, which is metallic gold, but the workflow is a bit different there. So I added that color later on. After this is done, we have laid a solid foundation for the next steps, and it didn't even take that much time. Before we talk about the next brush technique, let me introduce you to something that has helped me save a lot of time and that has taken a lot of stress out of my daily routine. Making videos means that I'm editing all day, and I'm grateful for any time saver, like not having to prepare or cook each meal that I want to eat. I still want to eat well though, so fast food is not an option and no one can afford constant takeout. And this is where Factor 75 comes in. With Factor, I don't have to plan what I could eat all week, I don't have to shop for groceries, and I also don't need to prepare every breakfast, lunch or dinner. It sucks losing work hours or having to sacrifice limited hobby time, but with Factor, I don't have to, because whether I'm editing or painting, I can just grab a healthy snack or heat a chef-prepared meal in 2 minutes so I can go right back to what I love to do. Factor supports your lifestyle and nutritional choices. You can choose your meals with a focus on protein, limit your calories, or even make every meal fit a ketogenic diet plan. Or you can mix and match and choose the best of everything from 34 plus meal options each week and 36 plus add-ons like smoothies, keto shakes or desserts. And as you can see, if you're using my link, you can grab a 50% discount on your first box, and that means you can get a meal for less than $6.50, which makes this offer an insane value and almost a no-brainer to try it. Plus, if you decide to give Factor a shot, I'm not gonna lie, I'm getting a massive kickback if you're ordering a box. So you can support your favorite nerd while stuffing your face with delicious food made from high-quality ingredients. So don't hesitate, get 50% off of your first Factor box and free wellness shots for life using my link. That means you can choose 2 wellness shots from 3 available flavors for every order while you're an active subscriber. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. Number 2, wet blending. Wet blending is a way to establish gradients really fast. The idea behind it is to mix colors on the miniature before they dry in, and we're basically just dragging one color into the other with the brush, and then we're trying to create a transition with a particular mixing movement. With beginners, the expectation is often that you just splotch on 2 colors next to each other on the mini, right on top of your primer, and then mix them together, and there's your perfect blend. But think back to when I was applying my base colors. I needed 2 or 3 layers for them to cover perfectly. So what happens if you are blending directly on your primer is that you will get a gradient, but the gradient is going to be broken up by the primer shining through. It's going to look spotty and inconsistent. So after the colors are blocked in, I'm reapplying the paints I want to blend together, and I start to drag one color into the other. I'm putting a lot of color on the mini because acrylics dry very fast, and also don't expect to be doing a lot of areas all at once. Usually I try to treat one spot start to finish before I move on to the next, and then I just reapply fresh paint there and do all of the steps again. I quickly clean the brush at this point, because having one of the colors in the brush while you are mixing them, it can quickly be too much compared to how much of the other color is there, and the gradient will skew towards that color. So you want to make sure that you mix roughly the same amount of color for a perfect gradient. Also, don't be afraid to reapply one color when your ratio is off. This is not an exact science, and it also depends if you're mixing a bright color and a dark one, or 2 equally bright colors, and it's also going to take a bit of practice to find out which brush movement is the best to mix these 2 colors together. You can see that I add back some of the bright color in the center of the chest, and then I drag it into the layers of the darker color that are still wet to fix a bit of the gradient, just so that you can see that it might take a few steps instead of just one, and that's perfectly fine. Don't think that this is a one and done thing. It usually takes a few steps and it's a bit of a back and forth. Also, don't be afraid to use this even if you are already very far into your painting process. Here I eventually wanted more color variation on the green, so I added the saturated magenta to the knees and then put some of the base green next to it and dragged it into the magenta. You can see that it just blends together, nothing is ruined, and if we have to re-establish some highlights, we can just do that with layers of paint. A variation of wet blending is the loaded brush technique, where you load the brush with your main color and then add a brush tip of the color you want to blend in. Usually a highlight color, but it works with just blending together 2 equally bright colors too. Then you place the brush tip where you want your highlight and drag it down. Paint on the brush will gradually overtake the color in the brush tip and create your gradient. It's a very fast technique, and if you can master it, you can create beautifully painted miniatures in next to no time. Wet blending has taught me a lot, mainly not to be afraid to just put paint on a mini and mix it there and to see what comes out of it. It's really great if you just want to have fun, adding color without being afraid and just moving fast. Try it, I'm sure you're going to have fun too. Number 3, layering. Layering is literally just in the sense of the word putting layers of paint on top of each other, and generally that means relatively undiluted and opaque layers of paint, as you can see by the paint I'm picking up from my palette. It's a quick way to get really striking highlights done, which means it's great for beginners, especially since I always recommend worrying about contrast first and about smoothness later, because the first is creating results and the second one is usually resulting in frustration. Again, it's a very quick way to paint, and it helps you getting your minis on the table if that is your focus. And the good thing is you can always use more transparent layers later once you have a bit more experience to refine these gradients. Obviously, the more in-between layers you mix, the smoother the result will be, but I find that's defeating the purpose a bit, since less layers usually helps you to go up in value very quickly and build that contrast that is needed on minis. So I'm putting these opaque layers in areas that I want a lot brighter, like that detail on the belly or the oval shape on the chest, and I just keep picking out all the individual shapes and place layers where I want them to be brighter. I know that it might not be obvious right away where to put these highlights, but don't worry about that. Just practice the process and you will see where the highlights make sense and where they don't. just through practice, and you can always look up references. Eventually, I mix in more and more of the highlight color and cover less area with each subsequent layer. And while we are sacrificing some smoothness, you can see how that slowly starts to define all of these shapes, and it makes it look like there's light catching on and reflecting from these surfaces. Eventually, I mix in more of the highlight color and cover less area with each subsequent layer. And while we are sacrificing some smoothness, you can see how that slowly starts to define all of these shapes and makes it look like there's light catching on and reflecting from the surfaces. I'm going through all features of the Mini and try to make them look more three-dimensional and exaggerated to increase the contrast, because I don't care that much about blending. I can go fast and really enjoy the process. And I don't have to worry about ruining a gradient I painfully established through 20 other layers before. So don't be afraid, brushstrokes are your friend. In this case, here on the tail, we can add additional detail like these lines that maybe correspond to wrinkled skin because of how the tail usually moves. Or these highlights on the elbows. And of course, something like leather always looks more intriguing when it's textured. Number 4, washes. When talking about brush skills, washes might not be what you're thinking of right away. Some people might argue it doesn't take a lot of skill to slap a wash on a Mini, but that's not really true. So while here the wash primarily darkens all recesses and it doesn't really care about the features, it just follows gravity and capillary effects, we can also direct the wash with the brush. I always try to make them stay in areas that would be darker because they're facing down or maybe they are further down on the miniature. And that establishes some really quick but credible and awesome shading. I will usually drag some of the wash to these areas and then make it pool there. This can be done with just one thick layer, but usually I use 2 or 3 thinner layers, simply because I have more control. But be careful, it's a good idea to leave each layer to dry before you touch that area again, because otherwise you scrape away pigment that is still wet, and it ends up looking ugly and you get the dreaded coffee staining. Another thing washes are good for is if you want to add color variety. Like this orange here that I want to stain the recesses only, so wick away all the excess paint from the raised areas with a brush as much as possible. But this also shows one of the weaknesses of washes. They usually stain all of the area you apply them to. A wash doesn't only darken the recesses, it's also going to stain your highlights. And you don't want to end up with something like a washed out blue on an area you already highlighted, like in this example. But this is still a powerful and quick way to establish shadows and create quick gradients on different surfaces. Just direct a blob of paint to a spot you want darker and make sure it stays there by holding the Mini in a way that gravity keeps the pigment where you want it. For example, it would be a bad idea to turn the Mini upside down right now if I wanted the shading on the shield facing down. And again, you can use one opaque layer or several thin ones depending on how much time you want to invest and the desired result. Number 5. Dry brushing is an effective way to create highlights very quickly, especially on areas that have a lot of raised detail, like fur or chainmail. And you can use one of these made for dry brushing brushes. They exist in different price ranges. For example, Artist Opus sells high quality, expensive versions. Personally, I picked up these cheaper ones by AK Interactive, or you can simply get makeup brushes. You want the brush to have stiffer bristles, but the bristles on these specialized ones are also finer towards the end, which minimizes the typical texture you get when dry brushing. Here I want to highlight the metallics, so I soak my brush in undiluted paint, and then I get rid of most of it again on a paper towel. And then I run it over these raised features, particularly the edges on the gold parts until they are bright enough. It's better to drag the brush over the features a couple of times with a softer touch than pressing down hard once, since that gives smoother results without the typical grainy texture. I can also use this to smooth out transitions, like on the center highlight of the shield. Just slightly dragging the brush across the section where the wash stained the gold a bit too roughly. And you can see that this is just an awesome way to refine gradients. But I also run the brush across the edges of the shield and the line detail at the top to pronounce all of the edges that grab the brighter paint while the recesses stay dark. Dry brushing is a really great technique if you want to go fast, and especially in combination with washes, you can get really quick results. Number 6, edge highlighting. Edge highlighting is probably the most commonly known technique, especially since Games Workshop uses it to put highlights on all of their miniatures. But almost everyone uses edge highlights simply because it's a technique that mimics how light behaves on surfaces. This is the technique where you want to bring out your good brushes so you have a sharp tip. Because even though the bulk of your painting will be done with the side of the brush, sometimes you won't be able to angle your brush in a way you need to, whether it's because the space is too confined or the edge is not wide enough. But sometimes you will have to drag your brush along like this to get paint on the edge properly, and then a sharp brush tip just helps a lot. Another thing to do when edge highlighting is to make sure you don't have too much paint on the brush so it doesn't run into recesses and it always stays controllable. You can get rid of all the excess paint by just wiping the brush once over a paper towel. Then I just drag the brush along the edge like this, and I slowly define all the shapes. Usually it's a good idea to add 2 or 3 highlights with gradually brighter color, covering less space every time. Like you can see me do here, where I focus bright spots on apex points and corners of the lines I just highlighted. This helps with increasing the contrast without making the edges too bright. There's a little bit more to edge highlighting, unless you want to go for a more cartoonish look like Games Workshop does, where they highlight all of the edges in a very similar way. And I explained all of that in this video. I'll link it in the description if you want to go on a deeper dive on the edge highlights. But generally, edge highlights are a great way to define the shapes of your mini and make them stand out. It will, however, take a bit of time to master, so practice how much paint you should have on your brush, how to angle it properly against the edge of the mini, and how hard you need to press down in order not to make the lines too thick. But once you have all of that figured out, edge highlighting is going to become a staple in your painting that you don't want to miss. Number 7, glazing. Glazing is not usually considered a beginner technique, but I think it can teach you a lot about what painting comes down to, how you can use the tools that are available to you. Glazing is just using really thin layers of paint stacked on top of each other, transparent enough for the layer below to shine through. It teaches you about thinning paints and how much paint to pick up with the brush, and you will also learn the influence your brush movement has on your painting. And you can practice all of this individually. If your paint is too thick, then thin it a bit more. If there's too much paint on your brush and it's runny, then wipe off more of it on your paper towel. And as far as brush movement goes, you can see that I push the pigments away from the green area and towards the parts I want to be more magenta. And that also creates a transition, because a brush stroke will always leave less paint where you put down the brush than where you will lift it off. And using transparent layers stacked on top of each other, if you cover less and less area, you will create the gradient simply because the transparency is going to be less and less the more layers you stack on top. I use this whenever I want to smooth out transitions, or if you want a more subtle color shift like I did here on the leather straps. Just try this technique and watch how it ties everything together. Now, I'm perfectly aware that you don't want to spend ages applying a ton of thin layers on every mini in your army, but maybe you have that character model or general, that centerpiece of your army that is worth it to invest more time into, and then this technique will come in handy. So when you're just starting out as a miniature painter, it's a good idea to learn and practice these basic brush techniques. But what is even more important, and I wish someone sat me down and hammered this home when I started, is that you should not be limiting yourself when you're using these techniques. You can mix and match them any way you want. And the real question is not which of these techniques should I be using for this miniature, but what I always ask myself instead is, what result do I want and how do I get there? What do I need my brush to do for the desired effect? And sometimes that is mixing two techniques, like when I want to work over transitions that are too rough with glazes. Or maybe I want to do something that doesn't fit any of these descriptions at all. Like if I want to build a pattern, then I'll just dab the brush on with opaque paint and just see what happens. So now you have a good overview about all of these techniques, but it's still a bit difficult to imagine how you can combine them in an impactful way. Well, my fellow pigment pusher, you should be watching this video because you will see most techniques that I talked about applied there from start to finish. So watch it now and you can thank me later.